During the Second World War, the transformation of German society under the pressures of total war created one of the most significant demographic and labor shifts in modern European history. And at the center of this transformation stood the millions of German women who became indispensable to industrial production. Before the war, Nazi ideology had strongly emphasized the woman's role as mother, homemaker, and cultural guardian of the German nation, promoting an idealized vision of femininity rooted in domesticity and reproductive duty. Yet, as the conflict intensified and the demands of the war economy grew insurmountable, this ideological stance collided abruptly with the stark, practical reality of labor shortages caused by mass conscription, casualties, and the relentless acceleration of industrial output needed to sustain military campaigns on multiple fronts. Against this backdrop, German women were mobilized, initially reluctantly, later systematically, into factories, munitions plants, assembly lines, and metalworking shops, where their contributions became essential not only to the functioning of the war machine, but also to the survival of the German home front. Their entry into industrial labor marked a profound shift in gender norms, social expectations, and everyday life, challenging long-held beliefs about women's capabilities and place in society, even as propaganda attempted to frame their labor as a temporary sacrifice rather than a permanent redefinition of gender roles. The daily realities of these women were complex and often contradictory. They undertook physically strenuous, technically demanding work in environments marked by long hours, strict surveillance, and constant pressure to increase productivity, all while continuing to shoulder domestic responsibilities such as childcare, ration management, and household survival during an era of extreme scarcity. Inside the factories, women adapted to machinery, precision tasks, and repetitive production rhythms, developing new skills that would have been unthinkable for them to access in the pre-war labor market. Outside the factory gates, they navigated bombings, shortages, evacuations, and emotional strain, as husbands, fathers, and sons fought far from home. For many, factory work became a site of both empowerment and exploitation. Empowerment because industrial labor granted them a sense of competence, technical ability, and economic importance previously denied to them. And exploitation because the conditions were harsh, wages unequal, the hours exhausting, and the ideological pressure suffocating. The Nazi state sought to tightly control the image of these women, using propaganda to portray them as loyal, cheerful patriots contributing selflessly to the national cause, while simultaneously enforcing strict behavioral codes, monitoring interactions, and discouraging any notions that wartime labor might inspire long-term independence or shifts in gender identity. Yet, beneath these official narratives existed a far more nuanced and human story, one in which women forged friendships, endured fatigue, coped with fear, and negotiated their place within an authoritarian system that relied heavily on their labor while refusing to fully recognize their worth. The factories themselves became microcosms of wartime society, mixing routine with crisis, discipline with desperation, and technological progress with human suffering. As Allied bombing intensified and resources dwindled, working conditions became even more difficult. Women toiled in damaged buildings, dealt with food shortages that weakened their bodies, and sometimes worked through nights illuminated by air raid sirens. Despite these hardships, they kept production lines moving, often aware that the survival of their families, and in some cases their very lives, depended on continued employment and ration entitlements linked to factory work. The end of the war brought yet another transformation. As these women confronted defeat, occupation, and the sudden dismantling of the structures that had defined their labor. Many were pushed back into domestic roles, while others continued working in industries essential to rebuilding a devastated nation. Their experiences, however, were largely forgotten or overshadowed by dominant post-war narratives that emphasized women as victims of war, rather than participants whose labor shaped the trajectory of German society. Only decades later did historians begin to reassess the significance of these women, recognizing that their work not only sustained wartime production, but also laid foundations for post-war economic recovery and the eventual reshaping of gender roles in both East and West Germany. Understanding the story of German women in wartime factories thus requires exploring themes of coercion and agency, ideology and necessity, endurance and adaptation, all of which reveal how ordinary individuals navigate extraordinary pressures. Their labor was not merely a footnote to military history. It was a central component of the social fabric of wartime Germany, illustrating how total war transforms every aspect of life, from personal identity to national survival. The experiences of these women highlight the contradictions of a regime that praised feminine domesticity while demanding industrial labor, exposing the tension between ideology and reality that shaped everyday life in the Third Reich. Today, their stories stand as a testament to resilience, complexity, and the profound human capacity to adapt in times of crisis, offering a lens through which to understand not only the war, but also the enduring consequences of gendered labor in moments of national upheaval. The opening years of the Second World War marked a profound transformation in the German workforce, as the nation shifted into a state of total war that demanded unprecedented levels of production. Factories that once operated under predictable rhythms suddenly became engines of relentless output, and the state turned its attention to a labor source it had long ideologically confined to the home: women. Nazi ideology had celebrated domesticity as the highest duty of womanhood, emphasizing motherhood, racial purity, and household management as their central roles. But the war forced the regime to confront the contradiction between its ideological commitments and its economic necessity. Regardless of official propaganda, the immediate need for workers became too urgent to ignore, compelling the state to mobilize women into industrial labor on a nationwide scale. The mobilization of women did not occur suddenly. Instead, it emerged through a combination of policy shifts, economic pressures, and escalating military campaigns that depleted Germany's male labor force. As millions of men were drafted and deployed across Europe, the absence of skilled laborers became visible across all major sectors: metalworks, munitions, aircraft production, transport, and chemical factories. Government ministries began circulating directives that encouraged local authorities and employers to recruit women, while propaganda campaigns subtly reframed the narrative around female labor. Posters, radio broadcasts, and film reels portrayed industrial work as a patriotic extension of motherhood, positioning the factory floor as another battlefield where women could defend the fatherland. This shift in messaging allowed the regime to maintain symbolic consistency while still addressing the practical demands of war. While many women entered factories under a sense of patriotic duty, an equal number did so out of economic pressure. Wartime inflation, rationing, and the steady decline of domestic income made single-earner households increasingly unsustainable. Families, especially those with men at the front, relied on the wages women could earn from factory employment. This economic reality blurred the lines between voluntary service and forced participation, revealing the complex motivations that shaped women's entry into industrial labor. For many, factory work became a means of survival and stability, even as it represented a departure from traditionally expected roles. Employers, too, underwent a rapid transformation in attitudes. Initially resistant to training women for jobs traditionally seen as physically demanding or technically complex, factory managers gradually recognized their capabilities and adaptability. Women were assigned to assembly lines, quality inspection units, welding stations, and even precision machining, areas once considered inappropriate or beyond their skill. Factories introduced modified tools, adjusted machinery heights, and developed compartmentalized workflows that allowed women to handle industrial tasks with efficiency. This evolution highlighted not only the necessity of their labor, but also the misconceptions that had previously restricted their participation in the industrial economy. At the same time, the state instituted a system of monitoring and organization aimed at ensuring maximum labor efficiency. Women were registered, categorized, and evaluated for their suitability for industrial work. Labor offices expanded their reach, coordinating recruitment efforts and ensuring that every eligible woman could be assigned to a necessary position. While this system was framed as an orderly mobilization of national resources, it also reflected the authoritarian nature of the regime, which sought to control and direct labor just as it controlled political and social life. Women who resisted recruitment faced social pressure, bureaucratic scrutiny, and even accusations of failing their national duty, the same moralizing mechanisms that characterized Nazi governance across other aspects of civilian life. Despite the contradictions at the heart of their mobilization, women became indispensable to the wartime economy. By the mid-war years, female workers staffed a significant portion of Germany's production lines, contributing to the manufacture of aircraft components, ammunition, machinery, textiles, and countless other materials essential to sustaining the war. Their presence in factories challenged traditional norms, redefined societal expectations, and demonstrated the capacity of women to perform skilled industrial labor on a national scale. Though the regime never fully acknowledged the ideological shift at play, the mobilization of women represented one of the most significant internal transformations of wartime Germany. The call to industry thus marked both a moment of empowerment and contradiction. Women stepped into roles that had long been denied to them, navigating environments that demanded resilience, adaptability, and technical skill. Yet their expanded responsibilities remained overshadowed by an ideology that continued to minimize their contributions and restrict their public recognition. Nevertheless, their labor formed the backbone of the wartime economy, shaping not only the industrial output of the Reich, but also the broader social dynamics that would influence post-war society. The mobilization of women was not simply an economic adjustment, it was a historical shift that laid the foundation for future debates about gender, labor, and the meaning of citizenship in a nation at war. Life on the German factory floor during the Second World War unfolded within an atmosphere of urgency, discipline, and continuous strain. As production quotas grew more demanding, factories operated around the clock in multiple shifts, leaving workers, many of them women, to navigate grueling schedules that reshaped their daily existence. The moment the worker stepped through the factory gates, she entered a controlled environment in which noise, heat, and mechanical rhythm dictated the pace of the day. Machines clattered tirelessly, supervisors circulated with clipboards, and the pressure to maintain precision remained constant. This relentless tempo reflected the broader wartime reality. Every bolt tightened, every piece molded, and every round of ammunition completed was framed as a contribution to national survival. Working conditions varied depending on the sector, but the common thread across factories was the physical strain they imposed. Women, assigned to metalworks, handled heavy tools, repetitive motions, and machinery that required continuous vigilance. Those in munitions plants faced exposure to chemicals, explosions, and intense heat generated by production furnaces. Textile factories demanded long hours of standing, with eyes fixed on looms that required rapid adjustments. Despite the diversity of tasks, the expectations remained uniform: fast, accurate, and uninterrupted labor. Breaks were limited, and even those short pauses came with the backdrop of supervisors urging workers to return quickly, reminding them that delays could sabotage essential wartime output. Safety was a persistent concern on the factory floor. Protective gear was inconsistent, and shortages meant that women often worked with minimal shielding from sparks, fumes, or sharp equipment. Many learned to wrap their hands or arms with cloth to reduce injuries, while others improvised forms of protection depending on their tasks. Accidents, ranging from minor cuts to severe machinery-related injuries, were not uncommon. Exhaustion only heightened these risks, especially during night shifts when concentration waned. The state recognized the hazards but prioritized production over worker welfare, addressing safety largely in terms of maintaining labor efficiency rather than ensuring humane conditions. The noise inside factories was nearly inescapable. Machines operated at full intensity, drowning out conversation and creating a constant wall of sound. Workers developed ways to communicate through gestures, eye contact, and practiced routines that allowed them to function without verbal instructions. Over time, many became adept at interpreting mechanical rhythms, detecting irregularities in sound that signaled a malfunction or potential danger. This sensory familiarity became a survival skill on the factory floor, reflecting the deep adaptation required to function effectively in wartime industrial environments. Training for German women entering wartime factories unfolded as a rapid and often improvised process, shaped by the urgency of the war economy and the growing demand for skilled labor. Most women had little to no prior exposure to industrial machinery, yet they were expected to master complex equipment within days or weeks. Factories established condensed training programs designed to introduce basic machine handling, safety protocols, and standardized production techniques. These sessions took place on-site, usually led by experienced male workers or foremen, who were themselves adjusting to the influx of new laborers. The training was intensely practical, focused less on theoretical instruction and more on enabling women to perform repetitive tasks with precision and consistency. This compressed learning environment created both anxiety and determination, challenging women to quickly adapt to expectations that would normally require months of preparation. As women learned their roles, a clear hierarchy of tasks emerged. Basic assembly and sorting jobs were usually assigned first, allowing new workers to develop familiarity with tools and workflows. Over time, those who demonstrated aptitude were selected for more specialized roles: welding, milling, metal shaping, fuse assembly, or quality inspection. These positions demanded higher skill levels, and thus new forms of training evolved within the factory setting. Foremen began developing informal apprenticeships in which experienced workers mentored newcomers, offering guidance through demonstration and correction. Although these arrangements lacked formal structure, they became essential to maintaining the pace of production. Women absorbed knowledge through observation, repetition, and trial, gradually growing confident in tasks once believed to fall exclusively within the domain of trained male labor. Adaptation extended beyond technical skill. The physical demands of factory labor required women to build new forms of endurance. They adjusted their posture to the rhythm of machines, learned to brace themselves while lifting heavy materials, and fine-tuned their hand movements to maintain speed without sacrificing accuracy. Many developed personal techniques that reduced strain or increased efficiency, tactics that spread informally among workers and contributed to collective skill development. In this way, adaptation became both an individual and communal process, shaped not only by official instruction but also by the shared strategies women exchanged to survive the intense conditions of the production line. The wartime need for precision also reshaped the relationship between women and technology. Machines that once seemed intimidating became familiar tools as workers learned to handle controls, recognize mechanical irregularities, and interpret the subtle cues that signaled when adjustments were needed. Women in aircraft and munitions factories in particular faced tasks that required meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that components met strict military standards. Training in these sectors emphasized accuracy, measurement, and repeated inspection, demanding a level of focus that often surpassed expectations set at the beginning of the war. As women grew more proficient, many were entrusted with responsibilities that reflected their expanding competence, managing workstations, inspecting final products, and even instructing new recruits. Psychological adaptation played an equally important role in women's integration into industrial labor. The shift from domestic environments to high-pressure production spaces required mental resilience and a willingness to confront unfamiliar challenges. Women learned to navigate the authoritative structure of factories, balancing obedience to supervisors with the confidence needed to perform complex tasks. They also adapted to the stress of long hours, the relentless pace of machinery, and the knowledge that mistakes could have far-reaching consequences. Over time, many developed a sense of pride in their ability to master skills previously denied to them, finding empowerment in their growing expertise despite the harsh demands of the wartime economy. However, training and adaptation took place under conditions shaped by inequality. Women were often paid less than men for equivalent work, regardless of their level of skill. They received shorter training periods, fewer opportunities for advancement, and less recognition for their contributions. Supervisors treated women's labor as temporary, reinforcing the expectation that they would eventually return to domestic roles once the war ended. Despite these limitations, women persisted, absorbing skills that allowed them to challenge gender norms and demonstrate their capacity to contribute meaningfully to industrial production. As the war progressed and Germany's situation grew more desperate, training programs evolved to become more structured and systematized. Factories introduced instructional manuals, diagrams, and short courses designed to accelerate the learning process. Technical schools, previously reserved for male apprentices, opened limited sessions for women, focusing on metalwork, measurement, and machine operation. These efforts, though still constrained by gender biases, revealed an increasing recognition of women's value within the industrial system. By the later years of the war, women were no longer simply filling gaps in the workforce, they were essential workers whose skills had become central to sustaining production. The adaptation of women to factory labor thus represented both a practical achievement and a symbolic shift. Through accelerated training, hands-on learning, and persistent determination, women mastered roles that challenged pre-war assumptions about their capabilities. Their skill development became a testament to their resilience, altering perceptions of gendered labor and leaving a legacy that would influence post-war debates about women's rights and economic participation. Even as the regime sought to minimize the long-term impact of these changes, the transformations in training and adaptation could not easily be undone. The women who entered wartime factories had forged new identities as trained industrial workers, identities that would remain with them long after the machines fell silent. For German women working in wartime factories, the challenge of balancing domestic responsibilities with industrial labor became one of the defining struggles of their daily lives. Even as the state demanded their participation in the industrial workforce, it continued to promote traditional expectations of women as primary caretakers of the household. This ideological contradiction placed women under immense pressure, as they were expected to maintain homes, raise children, manage rationing, and tend to family needs, while simultaneously meeting the relentless demands of factory shifts. Their dual burdens revealed the deep tensions within wartime society, where necessity forced women into new roles, while cultural norms insisted that nothing about their domestic duties should change. A woman's day often began long before she stepped onto the factory floor. Early mornings were devoted to preparing meals, organizing children for school or childcare, cleaning living spaces, and ensuring that rationed food supplies were stretched effectively. Simple tasks became more complicated under wartime shortages, requiring careful planning and improvisation. Women queued for ration cards, visited multiple shops to secure basic necessities, and performed repairs on household items that could no longer be easily replaced. These routine responsibilities set the rhythm for domestic life, and even after exhausting shifts, women returned home to continue the work expected of them, often late into the evening. Childcare emerged as one of the most pressing concerns for working mothers. Although the regime established some childcare facilities and community centers, these services were inconsistent and often understaffed. Many women relied on relatives, neighbors, or older children to supervise younger siblings while they worked. This informal network of support formed a crucial safety net, yet it also carried emotional weight as mothers struggled with guilt over their limited time at home. The absence of stable childcare reflected the state's conflicting messages. Women were needed in factories, yet their domestic responsibilities remained their unquestioned duty. The strain of balancing household duties with industrial labor became even more pronounced in families with men serving at the front. Women assumed full responsibility for all domestic and financial matters, from managing government correspondence to maintaining the physical condition of the home. They handled repairs, budgeting, and the emotional labor of sustaining morale through letters and care packages sent to soldiers. This increased workload left little room for rest, and many women described a sense of constant motion, moving between two worlds that demanded their complete attention. Despite these burdens, moments of resilience emerged. Women developed household routines that maximized efficiency, coordinating schedules with neighbors, sharing chores, and forming mutual aid groups that helped distribute the load among community members. They exchanged recipes to cope with scarce ingredients, shared childcare duties, and supported one another in navigating bureaucratic requirements. These communal strategies revealed a hidden structure of cooperation that allowed households to function despite overwhelming pressures. The solidarity that formed among women became an essential resource, reinforcing the sense of collective survival during an uncertain and exhausting period. The emotional toll of maintaining this balance was significant. Women faced chronic fatigue, anxiety over the safety of loved ones, and the constant fear that a single mistake in their factory work or domestic responsibilities could have serious consequences. Their contributions were rarely acknowledged publicly, as official propaganda continued to idealize women who excelled in domestic roles rather than those who succeeded in both spheres. This invisibility added to their psychological strain, leaving many feeling undervalued despite their indispensable role in sustaining the war effort on both the industrial and home fronts. Even leisure time became shaped by the pressures of balancing home and work. Moments of rest were brief, and women often used them to catch up on household tasks or prepare for upcoming shifts. However, they still found ways to maintain personal connections and emotional well-being, sharing conversations with neighbors, attending community gatherings when possible, or engaging in small hobbies that provided a sense of normalcy amid the demands of wartime life. The state attempted to frame women's dual responsibilities as a form of patriotic sacrifice. Propaganda emphasized the importance of maintaining orderly, disciplined homes as part of the national struggle, portraying domestic labor as morally equivalent to industrial work. Yet this messaging failed to address the reality that women were effectively performing two full-time jobs. Their experiences revealed the essential contradiction at the heart of Nazi ideology. Even as the regime relied heavily on women's labor, it refused to fully recognize or adjust its expectations regarding their domestic roles. Ultimately, the struggle to balance domestic responsibilities and industrial labor illustrates the broader complexity of women's experiences during the war. They navigated overlapping spheres of obligation that stretched their physical and emotional limits, yet they persevered with remarkable determination. Their efforts sustained families, supported industrial production, and upheld the social fabric of wartime Germany. The dual roles they assumed not only highlight their resilience, but also expose the inequities embedded in a system that demanded everything from them while offering little structural support in return. In retrospect, this balance or imbalance became one of the defining legacies of women's wartime labor. It demonstrated that women were capable of managing extensive responsibilities both inside and outside the home, challenging long-standing assumptions about gender roles. The experiences of these women would later inform post-war debates about equality, labor rights, and the redistribution of domestic work. Though often overlooked in official records, the dual burdens shouldered by women formed a critical part of the social reality of wartime Germany, shaping both their identities and the nation's trajectory in the years that followed. The role of propaganda in shaping the experiences of German women working in wartime factories was profound and pervasive. The Nazi regime relied heavily on imagery, messaging, and ideological framing to maintain social coherence during a period of intense disruption. Even as women became central to industrial production, propaganda sought to reconcile their expanding labor roles with traditional expectations of femininity. Posters, radio broadcasts, speeches, and newsreels depicted women as loyal, disciplined, and self-sacrificing patriots whose participation in factory work was merely an extension of their duties as wives and mothers. This narrative blurred the contradictions that lay at the heart of wartime policy, allowing the regime to promote female labor while simultaneously insisting that gender roles remained unchanged. Through this selective portrayal, propaganda provided an ideological shield that masked the structural tensions created by women's unprecedented entry into industrial labor. Factory-based propaganda took many forms, ranging from inspirational slogans to daily announcements tailored to encourage productivity. Factories frequently displayed posters emphasizing duty, unity, and perseverance. Messages linked increased output directly to the survival of soldiers at the front. Women were encouraged to view their factory work as a patriotic battlefield, one in which precision and efficiency were weapons of national defense. Management reinforced these ideas during morning briefings, highlighting production goals and celebrating workers who exceeded expectations. These rituals were designed to cultivate emotional investment and reinforce social responsibility, ensuring that workers internalized the values the regime sought to impose. The control mechanisms accompanying propaganda were equally significant. Factories operated under strict oversight, with supervisors monitoring worker behavior not only to maintain productivity but also to uphold ideological discipline. The regime encouraged employers to watch for signs of dissent, lack of enthusiasm, or behaviors deemed unpatriotic. Women's conversations, actions, and attitudes were subject to scrutiny, creating an atmosphere in which personal expression felt potentially risky. This surveillance extended beyond visible behaviors. Even the slightest complaint about working conditions or shortages could be interpreted as a lack of loyalty. This contributed to the climate of fear that permeated daily life, shaping how women interacted with one another and how they navigated workplace expectations. The system of social surveillance went beyond formal supervisory structures. The regime relied heavily on informal networks of observation, encouraging workers to monitor their colleagues and report suspicious activities. This tactic fostered a sense of mistrust, as women became aware that any peer might serve as the eyes and ears of the state. The result was a fractured social environment in which genuine friendships and camaraderie were difficult to sustain. Whispered conversations and private frustrations had to be carefully managed, as even innocent remarks could provoke unwanted attention from authorities. Yet this atmosphere also stimulated quiet acts of solidarity, as small groups of women learned whom they could trust and developed discreet ways to support one another under the constant gaze of official and unofficial observers. Central to the regime's control strategy was the depiction of idealized female behavior. Propaganda glorified women who exhibited unwavering loyalty, tireless energy, and emotional restraint. These idealized images served as benchmarks against which real women were measured, creating psychological pressure to conform. Magazines and broadcasts featuring smiling factory workers framed labor as joyful and fulfilling, despite the harsh conditions that workers endured in reality. By saturating public spaces with idealized portrayals, the regime sought to normalize the sacrifices demanded of women and to suppress dissatisfaction. This gap between representation and experience became one of the defining features of the propaganda system, shaping how women viewed themselves and their responsibilities. The reach of propaganda extended into the domestic sphere, reinforcing the expectation that women's identities remained centered on family, even as they engaged in industrial work. Posters showed mothers balancing household duties with factory shifts, presenting an unrealistic harmonization of the dual burdens women carried. Domestic magazines reprinted articles advising women on how to maintain order, cook efficiently with rationed ingredients, and preserve household morale, all while upholding the image of a loyal industrial worker. These messages served to minimize the hardships women faced, promoting an ideal that few could realistically achieve. The psychological strain of this dissonance added a quiet but significant burden to the lived experiences of factory workers. The role of propaganda was also evident in how the regime framed the presence of foreign forced laborers working alongside German women. Official messaging emphasized the superiority of German workers, portraying them as models of discipline and reliability. At the same time, surveillance of interactions between German women and foreign laborers was intensified. Women were cautioned against forming personal bonds with these individuals, and any hint of fraternization was met with severe penalties. This dynamic heightened social divisions within factories and reinforced the hierarchical structures central to the Nazi worldview. Propaganda played a key role in maintaining these boundaries, shaping attitudes that would persist even after the war. Despite the regime's efforts, acts of quiet resistance occasionally emerged within the factory setting. Women sometimes found subtle ways to push back against oppressive expectations, whether through small delays, mutual support, or private expressions of dissatisfaction. These forms of resistance rarely threatened the broader system, but they reflected underlying tensions that propaganda could not fully suppress. As the war progressed and conditions deteriorated, the effectiveness of propaganda began to wane. Workers grew increasingly skeptical of official messages that no longer matched the harsh realities of shortages, exhaustion, and mounting losses on the front lines. The gap between ideology and lived experience became increasingly difficult to bridge, weakening the control the regime sought to maintain. The multifaceted system of propaganda and surveillance that shaped women's experiences in wartime factories reveals the extent to which the Nazi state relied on psychological as well as physical control. Women were expected to internalize ideological values, maintain discipline, and embody ideals that often stood in sharp contrast to their everyday realities. Their movements, conversations, and emotional expressions were subtly and overtly regulated, reflecting the totalitarian nature of the regime. At the same time, the persistence of informal acts of solidarity demonstrated that control was never absolute. The resilience and quiet defiance shown by many women revealed the limits of propaganda in suppressing individual and collective agency. In the end, the interplay between propaganda, control, and social surveillance in wartime factories shaped both the workplace environment and the broader social order of the period. It created an atmosphere in which fear and loyalty coexisted, shaping how women understood their roles and responsibilities. The pressures exerted by the regime left a lasting impression, influencing post-war reflections on authority, labor, and gender. The experiences of these women serve as a reminder of the complex ways in which propaganda can shape daily life, constructing narratives that obscure reality while attempting to direct the behavior of entire populations. The end of the war in 1945 forced German women who had worked in factories to confront a rapidly changing social reality, one shaped by defeat, occupation, and the collapse of the ideological framework that had defined their lives for more than a decade. Factories that had once symbolized national duty and wartime urgency were now sites of destruction, repurposing, or complete abandonment. For many women, the transition meant an abrupt shift from structured industrial labor to a world marked by uncertainty, scarcity, and emotional exhaustion. Their wartime skills, once essential to sustaining the German war machine, now existed in a society struggling to rebuild both materially and morally. In the post-war years, women who had worked on production lines found themselves grappling with contradictory social judgments. During the war, the regime had framed their labor as an act of patriotic sacrifice. After the war, however, discussions about responsibility, complicity, and ideology made such labor morally ambiguous. Some women felt pride in their contribution to survival during national crisis, while others began to question the extent to which their participation, though often coerced or economically necessary, was entangled with a system that had caused immeasurable suffering. This internal conflict formed a major part of their legacy. The occupation period introduced new administrative structures, new expectations, and new cultural influences that reshaped the meaning of women's labor. Under Allied supervision, many factories were dismantled, while others were restored to produce goods essential for reconstruction. Women who returned to industrial work in this environment did so in a context free of Nazi ideological pressure, but marked by profound economic hardship. Rationing, displacement, and political fragmentation shaped everyday life, and industrial labor became less about national ideology and more about survival and rebuilding livelihoods. German women's experiences varied significantly between the Allied zones. In the Soviet zone, where industrial reconstruction became a central priority, women were often encouraged and, in some cases, pressured to continue or expand their participation in heavy industry. This laid early foundations for the later East German emphasis on women's full-time employment. In contrast, the Western zones placed greater emphasis on restoring traditional family structures, even though economic necessity ensured that many women remained in the workforce. These divergent paths contributed to different post-war gender norms that persisted throughout the Cold War and beyond. Another critical dimension of this post-war legacy involved memory and narrative. In the immediate aftermath of the war, public discourse often minimized or erased the role women played as industrial laborers. Instead, narratives of women as victims of bombing, hunger, displacement, and sexual violence dominated collective memory. While these experiences were real and significant, they overshadowed the substantial contributions women made to wartime production. Only decades later, as historians and survivors revisited these histories, did the complexity of women's industrial labor re-emerge as a subject worthy of nuanced study. As Germany rebuilt itself, women who had gained technical skills and experience on the production line carried those abilities into new economic opportunities. Some continued industrial work in post-war factories. Others transitioned into sectors such as textiles, electronics, or clerical work, where their wartime training provided an advantage. The post-war economic boom, particularly in West Germany, opened new possibilities, though gender inequality in wages, promotions, and recognition remained entrenched. Nevertheless, their wartime labor inadvertently laid a foundation for the long-term transformation of women's participation in the formal workforce. The emotional and psychological impact of wartime factory work formed another enduring layer of this legacy. Many women carried memories of long shifts, physical exhaustion, constant fear, and the pressure to meet impossible production targets. The sounds, smells, and rhythms of factory life became embedded in their identities. The war's end did not erase these memories. Instead, they shaped the way women understood themselves, their resilience, and their relationship to labor. For some, these experiences fostered a lifelong sense of capability and independence. For others, they left deep exhaustion and trauma. In the decades following the war, German society gradually re-evaluated the wartime contributions of women, moving beyond simplistic portrayals of passivity or compulsory obedience. Scholars, memoirists, and social historians began to explore the contradictions and complexities of women's industrial labor. These studies highlighted the ways women navigated coercion, necessity, pride, moral ambiguity, and survival within a highly controlled wartime system. This growing body of research contributed to a more comprehensive understanding of everyday life under dictatorship and total war. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the story of German women in wartime factories became an important reference point for discussions about gender, labor, and historical responsibility. Their experiences challenged traditional narratives about women's roles and demonstrated the profound ways in which war reshapes social structures. Their skills, adaptability, and strength displayed contributed to Germany's post-war reconstruction and influenced later movements for gender equality and labor rights. Though their labor was once instrumentalized by an oppressive regime, their resilience became part of a broader narrative about human endurance under extraordinary circumstances. Ultimately, the legacy of German women on the wartime production lines is a testament to the complex intersections of gender, ideology, labor, and survival. Their contributions cannot be understood solely through the lens of propaganda or victimhood. Instead, they must be viewed within the broader historical forces that shaped their choices and constrained their options. As modern scholarship continues to uncover and reinterpret these histories, the experiences of these women stand as a powerful reminder of how ordinary individuals navigate extraordinary pressures, and how their stories help future generations understand the social, economic, and moral consequences of total war.